Hi, everyone, and welcome to Radical Civility. My name is Ben Piccini, and this is a project of Public Square magazine. Today, we're going to be talking with Tom Stringham, who has this great Substack where he's writing a little bit more about culture, and especially Latter-day Saint culture. One of the things that is a little bit hard about right now and recording podcast episodes is that there's horrible things going on in the world. And with Russia and Ukraine and everything, it almost feels irreverent to talk about anything else. At the same time, there are always terrible things going on, and we try our best to take the ones where we can make a difference and do some good. So please know that I am aware and, in fact, would like to get a panel together in time to say something meaningful about Ukraine and Russia and put forward something good. I pray that by the time we get that together, it'll all be done and taken care of and resolved. But know that my heart is after that issue, and it's gripped me particularly strongly. And so if there's a way that we can, I would really like to see if we can speak to that. But for now, life moves on, and there are other things to talk about. But we will try and come back to that another time. So for now, let me introduce you to Tom Stringham, and we'll go from there. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ben Piccini, and this is Radical Civility, a project of Public Square magazine. And tonight I am joined by Meagan Kohler and Tom Stringham. So before we get started, Tom, do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit and talk about a little bit about what your interests are and your background?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. So my name is Tom Stringham. I'm a graduate student in economics up here in Toronto. And I am married with 3 little kids, and I have been writing as of the last month or so on a new sort of blog, stringham.substack.com. I used to have a blog way back when, but then stopped writing for a while. Now I'm back at it, and seems like there's an audience somewhat for some of the things I'm saying, and so I'm happy to be able to chat about it tonight.
Well, fantastic. I think that's exactly right. I think you've written 2 Substack articles that I've seen, and I've enjoyed them both immensely. I sent one to a few of my students who like to read interesting writing, and there was this great debate. They were like, "Wait a minute, hold on, we got to listen." It was great. It was wonderful. That's the sign of good writing, is that everybody wants to talk about it. So, we wanted to talk specifically about your last piece, which was about how LDS sexual ethics work, I think is what the title is, or something close to that. Why don't you give us a quick rundown of that? And then Meagan and I have a couple of questions we wanted to ask you.
Yeah, sure. So the idea of the article is that, well, it's a specific way that our sexual ethics works. So my argument is sort of that the sexual revolution was really bad for women in particular in a specific way. I relate this story. It's a true story, an overheard conversation in a university library where this young man is telling 2 or 3 young women that he knows, friends, about this girl who's been texting him, hitting him up, as he puts it. He's saying, we only dated for 3 days. And he's saying how awkward this is. And the girls are agreeing that's so cringe. And he's saying, yeah, she's really mad because I was her first. I took her virginity. And he's treating it so casually. And what surprised me wasn't so much that it happened, because this does unfortunately happen a lot in college, these sorts of bad relationships. But the fact that his female friends just nodded along and sort of agreed or appeared to agree with him that, yeah, women just shouldn't expect anything from men who just want sex. They should just, go along with it and then not expect any affection or commitment or anything at all. And it's cringe if you do. And you should just realize that just give men what they want and then move along. And so what this made me think was, it's a thought I've had before, but just how powerless women are in secular dating culture these days. In particular, powerless to induce men to enter into committed relationships with them, and marriage as well, of course. And I contrast that with dating culture in the church that I've been familiar with in my life. And while there are problems with our dating culture, Of course, it's not perfect. Women do have some power to induce men to enter into committed relationships with them and to get married. And some of that power that they have comes from the norms that we have around sexuality. So in particular, our norms enforced on both men and women that we don't have sex before marriage. And so if a man tries to pressure a woman in the church into having sex with him, she can say no, because she knows that he can't just go to other women and expect to get it from them in the church. We also have norms against exogamy or dating outside of the faith, especially for men, I would say, which is good as well, because that prevents men from going elsewhere. So it gives women sort of a bargaining power in their relationships with men. And this is maybe an awkward way to think about relationships. We tend to avoid wanting to think about relationships this way, but we have to, because the fact is that women have been disempowered by the sexual revolution in their relationships with men. And that matters. And it matters for women's well-being. And we see it show up in a lot of ways.
I remember hearing recently that the data since the sexual revolution is very interesting, and that happiness for men and women has dropped. I couldn't cite a statistic, so I apologize.
So there's quite a well-known paper from about 10 years ago called "The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness," and men's happiness actually has been pretty stable, but women's happiness has dropped in absolute terms and relative to men's substantially through the 70s, 80s, 90s. And of course, they call it a paradox because this has coincided with, in the mainstream narrative, all kinds of great things for women's rights and things. And a lot of good things have happened, but the sexual revolution, I would argue, is an obvious cause of why women are less happy in aggregate in developed countries.
I think one of the things that you bring out, and when you tell your first story about the library conversation, is how heartbreaking it is that this young woman is texting him and saying, "Hey, I thought we meant something. I thought there was something there." And he is there bragging not to a bunch of other guys about how cringe she is, but to a bunch of other women about how meaningless this interaction is. And contrasted, and I think that you made the case really well. It's been interesting. I've heard a lot lately about how shame is always bad, and any signal of stigma is always a bad thing, and that just seems to be, I don't know, not informed. I don't think anybody believes that. If somebody says something, if somebody kicks puppies, they should feel ashamed. That's a bad thing to do, right? I think we all agree on this. I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that we have different beliefs about good and bad. And I think that's what we're really using as a proxy, is like, well, shame is bad for the things that I don't think are wrong to begin with, right?
Right.
But your second...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
Go ahead.
One example that makes the point very clearly sometimes to people on the left more is racism. Like, that's something that should be stigmatized and shamed, and no one really fails to see that. So when it's something you really believe is wrong, it's and antisocial and destructive, it's easy to see why it should be stigmatized.
Well, and that's the example that I like to get. So in schools, we have a lot of these conversations about, punishment is bad. You shouldn't punish kids. And then I say, okay, well, what if the kid's racist? Well, yeah, no, you need to suspend them. And I'm like, oh, hold on then. Like, that's fine. I'm not saying you're wrong, but you're not actually arguing about what is good punishment. You're arguing that one thing just isn't a bad thing, that if a student is getting raucous on the playground, that it's not actually bad. And I think we can speak about this more clearly. You also mentioned something so the way that you turned the phrase was really interesting, which was, imagine having that conversation among, there's a night at the church activity, and there are 3 women, and there's a guy there who's now bragging about the same exploits. There is going to be stigma attached, and it's going to protect other women from being taken advantage of in that social setting. Right. And your writing is kind of, it's I wouldn't say it's in your face, but it's almost like it wakes you up to like, oh yeah, that's a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing. That actually protects other people and can be a positive. Meagan, I can see that you're waiting patiently to jump in. If I'm talking over you, you jump in.
No, not at all. I wanted to ask Tom, just kind of lay a little bit of groundwork. Do you think that what specific aspects of the sexual revolution do you think have penalized women? Like, what's the mechanism by which we're seeing this change dynamic?
Right. So I think the sexual revolution was bad in a number of ways. But the specific thing I'm thinking of is how in the mid 60s, over the course of really 4 or 5 years, it was very quick, norms against premarital sex almost completely vanished in the United States. And it's not fully understood exactly how it happened and how it happened so quickly, but it did happen very quickly. Obviously, it had something to do probably with new contraception technology. It had something to do with mass media and TV and things. But that erosion of those specific norms just obliterated women's bargaining power in the sexual or the dating marketplace. And specifically, so I kind of alluded to it before, but when women know that other women are willing to have sex without committed relationships, then it's very hard for them to demand it from men. That's just a fact because sex for men is cheaper. The benefits are higher in the immediate in the short run, and then the costs are lower, and the expected costs are lower. So for men, it's cheaper, and so in an unregulated sexual marketplace, men are going to have more power than women.
And so if I can jump in, Megan, I'm going to be rude and interrupt real quick. This conversation resonates with me because I have some understanding of economics, and it's one of those things where once you see things through economic lenses, it's very hard not to see them like you can't unsee it, right? For men and women, when you were talking about costs, if a woman engages in sex and runs the risk of pregnancy, that's simply something a man will never have. And if you want to talk about like inherent bias or inherent sexism, like that's on the universe, but like it's there, right? And so because of that, I was talking recently to some students who were, I teach women because I teach elementary education, which is primarily women at the school that I work at. It's like 95% women. And they were kind of bemoaning the lack of courtship. Right? Courtship used to be a thing and it's not there anymore. Now, fortunately, the kind of behavior you're describing is not present at BYU Idaho. But what they talked about is just that guys are dorks and they don't, they kind of ghost people and just like crummy behavior that just, it's not to the level you're describing. And they kind of agreed together, oh, wow, I didn't realize courtship would have helped us. Courtship protects women. Courtship allows for a group of, essentially for a group of women to say, no, this is the standard we expect you to rise to. And if you're not going to, then we're not interested. And I'm pairing that with a conversation with a friend of mine who's Jewish online, where she was talking about the same thing. And again, very economic terms. She said, it strikes me that courtship is essentially a cartel of women saying to men, that you won't get what you're after unless you're willing to pay the price of a committed relationship. And it needs to be at least, we're going to be able to impose some costs on you. And then she made the observation, which I'm sure is incredibly impolitic, that's part of why women treat other women really poorly if they break the code, because they're effectively scabs, right? And that, I'm not saying that's justified. I'm not saying that's okay, but in terms of economic behavior, that's precisely what you would anticipate. That's what you would predict in that kind of a marketplace.
So I guess for me, the question that comes to mind based on that is, I can hear somebody pushing back on this, saying, isn't it sexist to assume that women are disproportionately penalized by a lack of commitment? Like perhaps women are socially conditioned to want commitment, but that part of feminism, part of the sexual revolution has been, we're freeing them from those social constraints. So isn't it the case that it's not a man-woman thing, it's just this particular girl wanted commitment and this particular man did not?
Right. Yeah. And what's interesting is, at least as far as I can tell, I could be wrong in my perceptions, but in the last few years, the conversation or what I'm hearing from feminists has changed a little bit, where they actually are more often now saying, hold on, casual sex actually is not working out for women like it's working out for men. And we're not getting the same thing out of it as men are. And so we're sort of moving away from what they used to call sex positive feminism and back towards what they used to call sex negative feminism in some respects. And you see, like, I'm not sure if you've heard of this online group like Female Dating Strategy. on Reddit and elsewhere, but it's sort of, it seems like a reply to like the red pill sort of men's rights or men's kind of movement, where it's supposed to be this realist, like strategic, cynical kind of look at dating in female interests rather than male interests. And, you know, it seems like these women would all consider themselves feminist, but what's interesting is one of the things they are very firm on is do not let a man pressure you into having sex. Do not have sex outside a committed relationship. Do not move in with a man before you're married. He gains way more from that than you do, and you lose your leverage. So as a matter of strategy, just don't do it. And that's what they've come to. And I think that's what I think people are rediscovering, sort of the virtues of, you know, what we used to have. These norms were there for a reason.
So maybe those norms that we've been dismantling, we're sort of discovering some of the reasons why they existed in the first place.
Yeah, and so my reply, if someone said that, would be first, you know, go see what feminists are saying these days and why that you see these articles like, you know, the feminist case against casual sex or whatever, things like that, right?
And I don't think that that's to say, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tom, but that isn't to say that this always goes swimmingly, right? And there are individual women who want to deviate from that norm, and that's their choice, and they can, you know, live and let live. That's their choice. But I think that your point that really resonates with me is there's a difference in cost for men and women to engage in casual sex, right? It like looking at it, if I can be a little bit, you know, blunt, looking at the sexual revolution, going, you know, I think this really empowered women. I think there are a lot of men in the background cackling, going, yeah, definitely them. That's what we're doing this for. Like that, it's just silly, right? When you kind of take away the blanket and go, oh my goodness, this is so obviously going to be worse for a lot of women. Now, this reminds me a little bit of Jordan Peterson, who's kind of right now, at least in my mind, is the king of maybe we're throwing some institutions out the window, and there's a lot more baby going out with bathwater. That doesn't mean that there aren't imperfections and that it is enforced perfectly, but it does mean that maybe we should slow down and investigate. And I guess I would argue, I think some people will hear this conversation, immediately jump right to, oh, that's just sexism. And I think it's like, maybe hit pause. Maybe before you jump right to, this is the worst thing ever because somebody disagrees with me, they must be an evil conservative. Maybe let's talk this out as people who have different values, and that's okay. And if you want a different world, then that's fine. I'm not going to call you a horrible person, but let's admit that we're coming from different starting points and that we can have the conversation.
Well, and if I might just say too, to something, you know, kind of to Tom's point earlier, you know, of course, we're not going to demonize somebody who, you know, is a woman who makes so-called sexually liberated choices, but at the same time, undermining the norms that impacts all women. And I think that's why this is important to talk about, because we are not islands, you know, and we're starting to see that. Just, you know, that like he said, the most powerful part of his story was the fact that women were enforcing this against each other. So that matters.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, I often think of this quote by James E. Faust. I'm going to say it wrong, but I think it's, there are no completely private choices. And I think that's true. Everything we do, you know, it's hard to accept in our very individualistic culture, but everything we do does affect other people. Even things we do in private affect other people, believe it or not, because they affect us and they affect expectations and norms. And so we you know, it's a big burden to think of, you know, the moral weight of everything we do. So we can't think of every consequence of everything we do. But the fact is, when it comes to something like sex, the effects are massive.
I have a dear friend who said, and by the way, I lean pretty libertarian. I think it's got good policy and whatnot, but a good friend of mine just kind of cautioned me and said, yeah, libertarianism is great. It makes the assumption that all choices are completely private. And I think that's kind of something that I'm learning in my grumpy old age now, is that I think you're exactly right. I think that they affect norms. They affect, you know, normalizing different behaviors and how society views stuff. And that actually is really important for the kind of world that I want my kids to grow up in. And so I think that that's a valid point.
And just to add to one point about why it's more expensive for women, there are maybe three things I'd point out. And this is something that they say on female dating strategy as well. Because after I wrote this, I went and looked and saw what they were saying. But so men are pretty much guaranteed. I don't want to get too graphic, but in a sexual encounter, men get, pleasure, pretty much guaranteed. That's a pretty mechanical kind of thing. For women, especially when it comes to casual sex, that's not the case. So already there's an imbalance there. Men are getting something out of it that women often usually don't get. And then costs, there's pregnancy, of course. That's a big one. Even if you're using contraception, there's always that chance. And then also STDs. Women are, for most STDs, just for physiological reasons, are at more risk of contracting most STDs or STIs. And so it really is, and the fact that we don't acknowledge that, we talk about just getting rid of all the norms, just leveling the playing field. But the fact is we have to take into account these baseline differences, and it's in men's interest not to take them into account. And so, someone once described, I don't remember where, but described the sexual revolution as just having made male sexual preferences normative. And I think that is basically what it was.
Yeah, I love that description. And I know, I don't really have any data, but it just has always seemed patently dishonest to try to claim that women are not psychologically and emotionally different than men. And in when it comes to sex and dating, that they are disproportionately hurt with casual encounters. Women, I think, do more naturally crave commitment and emotional exclusivity. So again, I don't have any hard data, but I don't think that makes it less of a valid observation. And I think that a lot of the narratives that we see are trying to bury what was common sense for most of human history, which is that marriage largely protects women.
Well, and I'll add to the thing that you said about things I don't have data on, but I suspect are true. I'm willing to bet that sexual violence is very different between men and women too. And that's another area in which women fare a good deal worse than men do. Yeah. And it's the kind of thing where, in my mind, this is the kind of thing that just makes sense. But I've never understood. Now, you mentioned too, and I wanted to bring this up, Meagan, you mentioned, what about those women who just don't want commitment? And I would say, that's fine. That's their choice, right? I don't agree with it. And I want to be clear, I am not neutral, but I also think we're in a grown-up society and people have the right to choose their choices. What bothers me is when there's an implication that I'm speaking on behalf of women, when in fact, I think that's what some feminists are actually doing. And they're actually saying, well, no, women don't want commitment. And it's like, well, no, actually a lot do, right? Like that's a silly thing to say. And I'm not judging if somebody doesn't. If somebody is just willing, they want to live their life, that's their deal. But to kind of uniformly, and I think Jordan Peterson has started making this case probably a little stronger than I would. I don't think, he started to say most women actually want to have kids. And he's very, very strong about that. To which I don't think that it needs to be most women. It can be even a few women. But if that is their preference, then the change in norms affects them disproportionately. And it's okay to talk about that without being labeled sexist really, really fast.
Actually, for the first time in history, in the last decade or so, women's ideal or preferred fertility, the number of kids they report that they want to have in their lifetime, is lower than achieved fertility. Quite a bit lower. So whatever it is about our system is making it so that women are having fewer kids on average than they want to in their life for the first time.
So let me make sure that I understood that statistic. You're saying that for the first time now, women are having fewer kids than they want.
Yeah, our total fertility rate is something like 1.6, historically low. That's in the US. And desired fertility is something like, I don't remember exactly, but I want to say 2.4, something like that. So most women want 2 or 3 kids on average. But
and they're not having as many as they wish they could.
Yeah.
All right, well, I have a couple of questions. Meagan, did you have another one that you wanted to go for?
You go first.
So here's let me start with this idea of patriarchy, because there's something deep within me. And it's probably all just, deeply sexist ideas about the world and all of that stuff. I intend to teach my sons really clearly that sexual ethics are important, and that they're going to treat women with respect. And that's a pretty patriarchal kind of a system. And I don't know much, but I know that patriarchy is bad, right? And that all of those things. I want to teach my kids really carefully and really thoughtfully. I also want to make sure that I'm doing, I hope I'm not sounding like I'm lampooning the left as I talk about this. I try to grapple with this stuff earnestly. And yet, in my mind, I look at this and go, yeah, I'm going to teach my daughter to be safe, and I'm going to teach my sons to be good, decent men. I think that that's a good message. I think that's something that everybody agrees on. I would hope that it is. But that's still dad coming in and telling everybody what to do. That's still patriarchy. Like, I think that there's this CDC article that I share with my students in class. It's all about father involvement, right? And as it turns out, it leads to all sorts of positive impacts, right? Like, you have lower rates of teen pregnancy, you have lower rates of like all sorts of stuff just by the dad being involved. So I guess what I'm asking is that like non-toxic patriarchy? Is that like healthy patriarchy, even like benevolent patriarchy? Like, what is the goal, and what should I be trying to teach my kids about this?
Meagan, I'm turning over to you first, because I think we briefly talked about this. So
yeah, I'm actually, that's the next thing I was going to ask you about. So I kind of had a sort of knee-jerk reaction to the word patriarchy, and I kind of asked you about it, and you pointed me towards a wonderful article that was written by a woman who sort of supports patriarchy, because it consists in something that I hadn't really considered, which is like men, good men, policing younger men, and that there's nothing inherently evil about a system like that. So I wanted to hear you talk about that, because it seems like that maybe informs a little bit of why you intentionally use a word like patriarchy.
Right. Yeah. So that article, I think she wrote it in. So her name is Lucinda Hancock. She wrote this blog post on Millennial Star, a Latter-day Saint blog, I think in 2015 or 2016, and the title is Paradoxical Patriarchy. And I read it when it came out, and I don't want to overstate it, but it changed my life. It really changed the way that I see the world. And anyone who's watching, just feel free to pause and go read that blog post. Just search Paradoxical Patriarchy, Lucinda Hancock, because it's, I think you'd agree, it's very, it's one of the clearest pieces of writing, you can find on the internet, and just packed with fascinating insights.
From a woman who I think has like eight eight kids or something.
Yeah, I think in a later blog post she says she has 9. So
Wow.
yeah. So what she says in the post, she starts off by observing that feminism has sort of failed to protect women from unscrupulous men. And I would add the sexual revolution as well, because often I think those two things get conflated, and they're related, but they're not the same thing. But it's failed to protect women. And in some ways, it's even made it worse for reasons similar to what I said in my blog post. And so she was thinking about, what is the solution? What do we do about this problem of unscrupulous men who are trying to evade the responsibilities of fatherhood, who are a threat to civilization? What do we do about
powerful language? A threat to civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like the oldest and most persistent sociological problem is what to do about men whose inclinations would just be to go and take advantage of women and spread their seed around, so to speak, and evade the responsibilities of fatherhood.
I believe the preferred term is menace to society, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's that apocryphal quote from Brigham Young that single men over a certain age are a menace to society. And it doesn't mean that, I've been a single man. I got married when I was 25, but it's not that you're a bad person. It's just that, men need structure. We need to be civilized in a way. We do best when we have expectations put upon us, and we have to live up to those expectations. Men need duties and responsibilities. That's what gives our lives meaning, and we need to channel our energy into those. So what
And
she argues is,
go ahead. No, I just along with that, it kind of seems like it's important that that is also, that comes from men. So it can't just be women policing men.
right, yeah. So what she says is her solution that she came up with was paradoxically patriarchy. And specifically, it's older or married men, particularly fathers, hence the word patriarchy, who have proven, their commitment and they have good values and all this sort of thing, policing young men and making the world safe for civilization and protecting women and children. Because the fact is, women, as a matter of physical fact, can't really police men at scale. I read this book by Francis Fukuyama, famous political philosopher, Origins of Political Order. And then towards the beginning, he says that there's no civilization we know of in history in which it wasn't patriarchal. There's no matriarchal system we're aware of in history. There are some matrilineal societies where lineage is determined through mothers and things, but there's no, as far as we know of, there's never been a matriarchal civilization at any scale. And so sort of rule by men is sort of a fact of nature, fortunately or unfortunately or whatever. But patriarchy, at least in the way Lucinda Hancock is defining it, is rule by fathers. And the danger of it is it can easily decay. It can be captured by unscrupulous men, men who just want power and ambition and want to take advantage of women, and they can use their power to abuse and hurt women. And that has happened many times throughout history. I think it's happening right now. I think one thing I agree with feminists about is we live in a patriarchal society in the sense that men are running
I was
running
just
the
going to
show.
say that seems like that's exactly what's happening. Is it's a rule by men. Only women are paradoxically less. They have less say and less control over things than they did.
Well, yeah. It's been captured by men who like to evade the responsibilities of fatherhood, and the people who make. Well, I won't get into too much of that, but I agree. What I was saying was I agree that we live in a society that's mostly run by men, and that the society is mostly bad for women. But what I do think is that there is a better form of patriarchy that is viable. That we see it in a smaller scale in the church, where I think it's a good thing that we have bishops that keep an eye on our YSA men, and interview them and subject them to consequences if they go out of line. Let's take one example. That we have intact families and fathers, where fathers instruct their sons and their daughters in the right way to behave around the opposite sex, and this is what we expect, and we enforce our norms of premarital sex on both men and women. One form of pushback I got on my post was, you can't expect women. It's wrong to expect women to be gatekeepers of sex, but I think both sexes should gatekeep sex. It's just that women benefit more from a situation where we're gatekeeping sex.
Well, but also this seems like it's a little bit of darned if you do, darned if you don't. No, you can't have a patriarchal system where men are policing other men. That's super sexist. We also don't think it's fair that women be the only gatekeepers. I mean, really, we need to have it not just be women. And it's like, fundamentally behind all of it, it's just that people don't like having sexual ethics. Like that's all it is. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But like, I think that you made the point really well. We do actually live in a society that is very, very heavily run by men. It's just a very corrupt patriarchy, right? At the end of the day, and let me put it even a little bit differently. Most of the issues that come up when, people talk to me about feminism, I'm like, yeah, I think I'm, probably broadly feminist. I think that's probably a broadly fair term. I don't really associate myself with them politically, and I've never rallied with them. But, women should vote. And I like the idea of making things better for them in the workplace. And when somebody tells me about a sexist incident, I get really mad. No problem with any of those. I still don't feel super comfortable with, a conversation around feminism, in part because mostly what we're talking about actually at the end of the day is sexual ethics. And I think most of those sexual ethics are actually just things I don't agree with. I don't think that they're good in a utilitarian sense. I don't think they're good morally, right? I don't think they work out well for women. And yet very quickly it's like, well, you're just a sexist. It's like, well, or maybe we could dig a little bit deeper, but whatever, to each their own.
Yeah, and that's why I like talking about the sexual revolution in context where I think others have talked about feminism, because I think it's more the phenomenon that's that explains a lot of what's going on. And because yeah, for the same reasons you just said, because I agree with feminists on a lot of things. Like I agree that men should take responsibility for other men's, police each other and that sort of thing, which a lot of feminists say, I think. But yeah, as you say, the disagreement comes down to sexual ethics, and somehow the sex positive feminists won with a lot of help from, Hugh Hefner and lots of men who are unscrupulous, which is unfortunate because it's really bad for women. So it's too bad. But I think maybe there's some realization now, as I was saying earlier, that, from feminists that, yeah, the status quo has not been working.
Let me ask you another question. I've got two more, and I'll try and make them quick because I don't want to let this get too long. Let's imagine a society in which what we're talking about here rules the day. Is this the kind of seed that eventually will yield the fruit of your damaged goods if you ever make a sexual mistake? Is that the downside to having strict norms of enforcement, where you're going to get shame messages and you're going to make people feel bad if they ever make a mistake, and there's not a lot of grace, and they're just they're feeling really beat up because now there's this norm, we've gotten that norm back, but the norm is enforced in such a way that if anybody deviates from the norm, it's scarlet letter time, and it's it's all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is norms and social costs. It is sort of in some respects, it's trading the well-being of the group against the well-being of the individual, and it is hard to be on the receiving end of stigma, whether but as going back to what you said earlier, we all believe in stigma for things that we really believe are antisocial and destructive, and so again, I think it comes down to a question of, do we really believe that it's right or wrong? But if, when you say to imagine that we have this kind of society we're describing, I think the closest we get is within the church, and I don't see a lot of that attitude. I mean, maybe I just haven't seen it, but and honestly, I think because I hear stories like on the internet of people saying, I was taught the chewed gum analogy or something, or the lit cupcake. I never heard that. As far as I know, my sisters didn't either. My wife hasn't. Maybe it's I don't know. Maybe it happened at one point in certain parts of the church or something. I'm not sure, but I hope we don't do that, because that wasn't my point with the blog post at all. My feeling towards the woman, the girl that the boy at the beginning in the story was describing, the girl who was texting him, was just compassion. I just felt so bad that she clearly had been pressured into this situation. She didn't want to have sex with this guy, probably. He pressured her into it. She wanted to keep him, so she relented because she thought that was the only way to keep him. But of course, he just left her anyway, and he didn't care. And she was heartbroken because she had these feelings for him, understandably, because she's a human being.
Well, and so I mean, you were asking about the shame mentality, Benjamin, and I see a lot of shame in the story that Tom related in his blog post. Unfortunately, it's leveled at the girl who was texting this guy, and so I think there is always danger of enforcement of norms, like people relying on shame to enforce norms, but that's exactly what was happening in the story that he related. There is a norm. It's an unspoken one. It's one that embraces the individual, supposedly, but that norm, I mean, those girls are, kind of making fun of this other girl, and added to that is whatever pain she's suffering as a result of this guy kind of ditching her. So it's not like there was less pain and less shame in this equation because of celebrating the individual. I think it just took a slightly different form.
I think that's an
That's
excellent
a great
point.
point.
I think that's an excellent point. And I would add too, if you're going to have strong norms, and by the way, this is something that is deep in me, like this is perhaps one of the deepest parts of who I am. High expectations and strong norms build better people. They build better societies. All of the parenting research says that if you have a choice between authoritative, authoritarian, and neglectful, that authoritative parents do the best by kids. And by the way, it's the same for teachers, right? If you have high expectations and high warmth and high love, those are the teachers that make the biggest difference for kids, bar none, no questions asked. There's a group of people that always seem to want to be lowering expectations because they're uncomfortable. When instead, I think that the answer, and this is something that we might have talked about once or twice in church, is something called atonement and grace and repentance and fixing things. Now, to your point, Tom, anybody out there who's listening, I'm sure that someone out there has heard the chewed gum analogy. I hope nobody ever does that again, because it sends the wrong message. It sends the message that there are things that are permanently and irretrievable, unfixable. And that's just not our doctrine. That's not what we believe. At the same time, we also have a doctrine that grace is not cheap. And it isn't cheap for any of us, no matter what our mistakes are, right? And that's because it's not because God is interested in, exacting a price. It's because we believe in a grace that is meaningful and that keeps us as safe as possible, that some of these norms and fences actually protect us from getting harmed or something like that. Let me ask my last question. And this one is one that I thought about recently a good deal. The woman taken in adultery. This is a very obvious thing for me to think. There was a man involved. And whoever found her caught in the act probably found him caught in the act, but they didn't bring him. Is there a chance that what ends up happening over time is that a corrupt patriarchal system is going to take it out on the woman? And I will be honest, I am very pro-life. And yet I see this a lot in conversations about abortion, where a woman is particularly reprehensible, but the man involved is essentially off scot-free. Right. And I will stipulate that I think that courtship and sexual norms and all of these things in part are built to protect against that, to try to equalize some of these costs. But is there a possibility that what this ends up leading to is kind of a one-sided enforcement of, wicked patriarchy enforcing the norms on women and kind of letting men off the hook and saying, well, boys will be boys?
Yeah, there is a risk of that. The woman caught in adultery, like you said, the law in Leviticus or Deuteronomy is that you stone both a man and a woman. But of course, they just brought the woman, and you wonder if maybe that's why Jesus was already so dismissive, is because they were already breaking their own law, and then expecting him to do their work for them, to do the dirty work for them. But yeah, I think that is, and I think that's an example of corruption right there, is that they decided to let the man go and bring the woman. And Lucinda Hadcock talks about this in her article. There, unfortunately in history, we see this in scriptures, we see these cycles where people are righteous, and then this righteousness leads to prosperity, and this prosperity leads to corruption and wickedness, which leads to humility and despair. And I don't know how you break out of that, but I think that's what we see. We benefited so much from, we look at North America. So I'm Canadian, you guys are American, but we inherited this, this rich continent, and we have freedoms, and we had a Christian background and all these great things. We had forebears who did so much for us. We've benefited so much. And now we've been so prosperous that we've just sort of spent all our cultural capital and just have wasted away our inheritance. And now we see the corruption and the problems, and our civilization is in decline, I think. And I don't know how you reverse that exactly, but the answer is yes. It's of course vulnerable, but of course I don't know what the alternative is. If, like I said, I think men sort of having political power is sort of a fact of human existence, and the alternative is effectively anarchy. A pre-agricultural world where the dominant male just keeps women, he controls women, and then there are lots of men who just, anyway, but so I guess, yeah, my answer is yes, and I wish I had a better answer of what can be done about it.
One thing I will say that in that article by Lucinda Hancock, she talks kind of like almost, she doesn't say exactly in these words, but patriarchy, if done correctly, is almost a process by which the leaders are vetted according to the commitment and responsibility that they've developed. Because if it's ruled by fathers, presumably it's ruled by good fathers. It's ruled by the kinds of fathers that keep the society safe and intact, and that protect all of the members of the society. Otherwise, well, anyway, I won't go into that, but I think that thinking of it not in terms of just led by males, but specifically led by males who have demonstrated the kinds of virtues that we believe make for good leaders is sort of what she's talking about.
That's interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Sorry. Yeah, so to be clear, when I'm talking about patriarchy and good patriarchy, I mean ruled by good fathers who have demonstrated virtue and that sort of thing. And you look at the church and the way it's structured, and our male leaders at the general level and at the local level are married men, and all the apostles have kids and grandkids, and that's not an accident. Our women leaders don't have to be married or have kids, but for men, we do vet them, and we need men who we can trust to hold to the rod and keep the men in good shape and protect what we have. And I guess actually maybe that is part of an answer to the question is, yes, it can degenerate, but look at the church's structure. I think it's built to sort of maintain as much as possible this healthy, virtuous kind of patriarchy. And I don't even care if it's called patriarchy, but just the system where fathers are taking responsibility for keeping everything in line.
It's so interesting that you say that. So Jordan Peterson talks a lot about dominance hierarchies, and that's where the whole lobster thing comes from. It's kind of entertaining to me. But his whole point is that competence hierarchies are actually what's really important, right? That you're rising to the top because you're actually good at something. And that those are really, really important for a society. And as he also mentions, and I think that this is obviously true, competence hierarchies are imperfect by their nature. Sometimes people climb to the top because they're corrupt and they're better at climbing the hierarchy than they are at actually being competent, at actually being good. And yet what you would want to have is a moral competence hierarchy in society. You would want to have a hierarchy where people climb to the top by being decent people, by being good and by being helpful and by serving others, and also by like running things in their own domain well, right? And I don't mean to imply that men run the house and need to tell their kids and their wife what to do, not at all. But I do think that there's something for being said to be said for if you are able to run your own home and take your responsibilities well and make sure your children are provided for. That's a mark of an important piece of character. And saying that is not actually that's not an anti-feminist burn. That's actually just a really important part of I think this idea of a moral hierarchy of competence. The other thing that I want to say, and maybe this is the note we can end on, is when I think about the things that make me feel most like a man, right? It's not lifting weights or cursing when I stub my toe or fixing things, right? There are things like providing for my family, teaching my children, teaching my young sons about sex and about like how to protect themselves and how to be decent men. These are things that are like very, very deep to me about what it means to be a father and to be a man, that I think are something that we should take pride in. I recently saw somebody was shooting around ideas online and they said, hey, maybe instead of toxic masculinity, instead of focusing on the masculinity part, maybe we should flip toxic to heroic. And so I asked a student, I said, what would you define as heroic masculinity? And this is a fairly, center left student who's very, savvy politically and leans a little bit feminist. And she looked at me, she says, oh, that's easy. It's Aragorn. I said, Aragorn, really? That's what you would go? You're like an enlightened feminist, icon person here. And she was like, no, it's absolutely Aragorn. He's got his stuff together. He's good looking. And like, look at that, he fights orcs and stuff. I think that it's okay to say that there is such a thing as good manliness. And that part of that is raising your sons to be good men.
And that women care about it. And it's okay for us as a society to teach women to value good aspects of masculinity.
Absolutely. And that doesn't mean that my wife isn't involved in teaching my kids about sex or enforcing norms or helping me to, when I say run our house, that's something that we do together as equal partners. But that the idea here that's really deep is like, that's okay to want to do, that there's something deeply fulfilling to me about doing these things, about climbing that hierarchy of moral competence where I want to be a decent person. And that's not something to be embarrassed about, right? That's something to laud and to be excited for. Well, any last thoughts really quick before we wrap up that are burning a hole in your pocket?
Just make sure to go read Paradoxical Patriarchy by Lisa Hancock. I really do recommend it. Like I said, it changed my life. It's a great.
Well, and also subscribe to Tom Stringham's Substack, because
if you want, if you're into that.
You're 2 for 2. The opinions expressed on Radical Civility are only the opinions of the participants and do not reflect the opinions of their employers or their faith or their former pet's owner, or even themselves when they are older and wiser. God bless everybody. Go do some good in the world.